Yo, guys, Justin Jaynes with the 10-7 here, and I just want to take a minute and talk about MMA Guru's take on American wrestling.
But I have a point, okay? And my point is, when I see wrestling credentials on a resume, on a US fighter, I used to, back in the day, fear that. Oh my God, this guy's a national champ. He's going to run through the division. In the modern era of MMA, if I see national champ, if I see Hodge trophy this, if I see some like references to some kind of wrestling credentials that they have and they went through the whole system over there in America, I'm starting to notice that these guys aren't as much of a formidable threat in MMA anymore. Nowhere near what they used to be, okay? And they're starting to get figured out and shut down by people who don't have that background. That's my take. People who have a wrestling background should be able to implement wrestling in an MMA fight against someone who didn't have that.
Now, in a video he did talking about American wrestling, he said, just when he sees that staple of greatness, and I say greatness because American wrestlers are incredible, wrestling being the hardest sport in the world, a million times harder than grappling, harder than MMA, harder than anything. That's why way harder than boxing. I mean, in boxing, you have to fight for almost 30 minutes, and guys are still on their feet, when collegiate wrestling is 7 minutes. And the reason it's so short is because it's so hard, and they have to do it over and over and over. Wrestling is the hardest sport in the world. And to classify American wrestling to any other nation of wrestling, it's like folk style wrestling is folk style wrestling. Freestyle wrestling is freestyle wrestling. It's not Russian wrestling versus American wrestling or Japanese wrestling. The movesets are mostly the same. Yeah, are there some differences? Yes, there's some slight differences. But when you talk about fighting, in that, the old school where you could have one discipline, whether it was wrestling, karate, grappling, grappling was the big one, and then wrestling came through, that American wrestling isn't effective anymore. And what he's saying is half true, and I think it was taken out of context. All right, what he was saying is if you come in straight with no boxing, no grappling, no wrestling, American wrestling isn't enough to win world championships anymore. And he's absolutely right. We talk about the evolution of the sport and how the sport is changing year to year, and stance switches are coming a lot more common. And back then, karate sitting by itself, could be a successful art, and every now and then you get a guy that can. But he's absolutely right. I mean, again, you need to be a mixed martial artist. MMA is not wrestling. There's wrestling moves that translate into MMA, but at the end of the day, these are two completely different sports. It's as different as rugby and football. Why don't rugby players do well in the American football or in the NFL, the National, American League? It's because it's a different sport, and people need to understand that. So going back to American wrestling versus, say, Russian wrestling, the Russians do have a couple more championships than the Americans do. I guess it's up to you. It's up for debate who has better wrestling, more gold medals versus more total medals. I guess there's a fair point there. But going back to the original discussion, American wrestling in MMA or in the UFC, and he's absolutely right. You can't just have wrestling. So depending on how you interpreted, his video, I'm agreeing with him in one sense, but American wrestling is very important to have. Remember, you're not just learning the wrestling skills. You're learning how to train because, back in the 90s, back in the early 2000s, when I was coming through, the only wrestling that was done was in high school, in college. And MMA, you're transitioning your high school, your wrestling into MMA, when right now at that age, instead of just focused on wrestling, they're focused on wrestling and grappling, or wrestling, grappling, and boxing instead of just one art, and they're able to mix it together a lot sooner. So anyways, he is right. It just depends on how you interpret the video. So